She'd found her mother lying in a pool of blood. There was shock across the whole town.
He was an extremely angry individual who felt cheated at life.
I want everybody to stop treating everybody like they're on their shoe.
A very dangerous man who could pass in society quietly underground until triggered.
He posted that chilling message.
Watch out for my next magic trick.
He was the angel of death.
On the stunning Sussex coastline lies the seaside town of Eastbourne.
Eastbourne has a traditional view that it's a retirement town where not a lot happens really.
And it's just really nice and it's friendly. You feel on the whole quite safe.
There's nice restaurants, cafes. It's lovely in the summer. It's quite magical in some ways. We love it.
I think there is quite a good neighbourhood vibe here and people know each other.
It's got a really tight-knit feel to it. There's a really good community spirit.
It's got palm trees and a sandy beach and the pier. It's just a sunny little town on the coast, really.
In this sunny little town on the coast lives Sabrina Cooper. At 68, she's not long retired from her family business.
Sabrina Cooper ran a magic shop in Eastbourne for a number of years. She was the niece of Tommy Cooper, the comedian and magician.
Tommy Cooper was the most celebrated comedian and magician for a generation. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that everyone within Eastbourne, and in fact throughout the whole country, would have known of the relationship between Sabrina Cooper and, of course, her very famous uncle Tommy Cooper. He was a household name, he was a legend.
In keeping with the family tradition, Sabrina's magic shop drew in tourists and residents alike.
I remember seeing the things in the magic shop, some of which looked quite intriguing.
And I remember the sign outside and all the painting, like I think it had a hat with a rabbit coming out and things like that.
Sabrina was very well liked. I mean, everybody in Eastbourne would have known the shop and probably been in it at some point and would have encountered a friendly woman who knew her stuff and was a well-known feature of the community.
She had more recently rented out that property to a burger company, but she remained living above it, and she was known around the cafes locally for always walking her dogs.
She had two dogs, Abra and Trix. Those two dogs were the love of her life. Sabrina was described by everyone who had met her as a kind, caring and loving lady. She would do any good deed for anyone. She was much loved within her family. She was a highly respected and much valued member of the community in Eastbourne.
For Sabrina, Christmas was a big time of the year. It was her favourite time of the year. And coming up to Christmas 2022 would have been a really important time for her.
On the 16th of December of 2022, Sabrina Cooper had completed on the sale of the property that she had owned, lived in, and had been the magic shop. She had been there for a number of years. She was moving on to the next chapter of her life, which was still to be in Eastbourne. She'd found a property that she wanted to move to. She was very excited to move out of the town centre and to have a quieter life.
But this festive season in Eastbourne will never be forgotten.
Shortly before 4 p.m, Sabrina's mother phoned Sabrina's daughter because she couldn't get hold of Sabrina on the telephone.
The daughter had tried to contact her mother on several occasions till eventually she went round to the actual property.
Sabrina's daughter arrived at Sabrina's house, saw a kitchen light on and assumed that Sabrina was in. Fortunately, she had a key, so allowed herself in. She put the key in the lock, turned the lock, entered.
and she found, shockingly, her mother lying at the bottom of the stairs with the 2 family dogs sitting by her side. It was a very, very chilling moment. On close inspection, she realised there was a large pool of blood on the floor, and her mother wasn't moving at all.
One of her arms was trapped beneath her body. It certainly wouldn't be something that you'd wish a daughter to find.
To find your mother in that state, or to find anybody in that state, would be utterly horrific.
Sabrina's daughter went straight to her mum, tried to shake her, tried to rouse her.
Her daughter came to realise at that specific moment, tragically, that her mother was dead.
Emergency services were called. Her mother had recently had a major operation. Initially, the fear was that she had injured herself and ruptured the stitches that she'd had from the abdominal surgery.
When the paramedics first arrived, initially, of course, they checked for signs of life and confirmed that she had in fact died. They assumed as well that she had had a fall and it was the surgical incisions that had bled. They called the police because it was a sudden death.
But it wasn't established until 9 p.m. later that night, when the police arrived, that in fact this was not a sudden death, that something more sinister was afoot.
They, together with the paramedics, examined Sabrina, and it was immediately apparent on doing so that she had suffered stab wounds.
A number of puncture wounds had been found on Sabrina's abdomen.
This wasn't some form of tragic accident. It was obvious to the paramedics that this lady had been murdered. This was a murder investigation.
Forensic investigators are called to Sabrina's home.
The first thing that the police would do in a crime scene is close that scene off.
That means gaining control of the scene. That means limiting the number of people within a scene. You want to preserve it as much as possible.
A scenes of crime officer would have attended with his team, and they would have checked for any form of forensic evidence, for any evidential clues that would assist them in their investigation. And of course, the key target was finding out who was responsible for this heinous crime.
Police need to consider if this is a burglary gone wrong.
Sabrina's purse was open. It looked like it'd been ransacked. There were no coins in there. There was no cash.
And there was a coin on the floor that they noticed, which they thought looked slightly out of place and odd.
Almost giving the impression that somebody had very quickly emptied the contents.
In fact, Sabrina's mother had given her a sum of money the day before. That money mysteriously was now missing.
But as officers continue to search the home, a different scenario begins to emerge.
Something sinister obviously had happened. But I think the first thing which is remarkable in this case is the police realised that there hadn't been a break-in. Nothing really had been ransacked, none of the windows had been smashed, the door locks were still secured. The evidence tends to suggest that it must have been someone who was known to this lady.
Sabrina was a single woman, but her daughter alerts the team to something else out of place.
It was rather odd because the table had been set for 2 people.
She noticed 2 used mugs in the sink.
There was a candle burning in the room. Just some really strange things that raised suspicions.
It's not long before news of a crime scene in the vicinity spreads.
I worked with a photographer in Eastbourne and he found the scene there and took pictures. Straight away, We knew there was a scene, we knew it looked like a murder. We were kind of trying to assess what was going on. The next thing to do is to contact the police and ask them. Eventually they confirmed that it was a murder inquiry.
When something particularly violent like a murder happens, there would have been shock across the whole town.
Sabrina Cooper was well known in the community, and of course when the police cordoned the area off, someone knew that it might be something to do with the shop and in fact Sabrina Cooper herself.
Everybody in Eastbourne would have known about this, and everybody would have had some connection to it somewhere along the line. So it would have affected most of the people in town.
And there would have been concerns that there appeared to be no apparent motive to it.
It is shocking to hear that, yeah. I mean, you wouldn't think that would happen to somebody who's just in the town running a shop.
There'd be uniformed police going door to door, trying to find anybody who saw or heard anything, and then looking for people to interview.
The priority of the police is to try and identify who was last in contact with Sabrina. Not necessarily because they're a suspect, but they are likely to be a relevant witness to help the police put together a timeline of what happened immediately before Sabrina's death. The police very soon afterwards were able to look at Sabrina's phone.
When the police checked Sabrina Cooper's phone, the first thing that they saw was there was a message from someone who was entered in her phone as Tony Friend.
There were 2 text messages. One asking her if she was okay, and the other saying, "On my way, see you in 10 minutes."
It was obviously their prime priority to find out who this individual was.
In Eastbourne, Sussex, the niece of the famous magician Tommy Cooper, 68-year-old Sabrina Cooper, has been found murdered in the hallway of her flat.
The post-mortem examination revealed that she had sustained 4 stab wounds. One of them had been with significant enough force to have cut through a rib.
This was a frenzied attack. 4 stab wounds committed with force. And also the pathologist noticed that there were defensive injuries to Sabrina Cooper's right hand, so she was frantically trying to ward off that dreadful attack upon her. Whilst the pathologist had deemed that the causation of death was due to the stab wounds to the abdomen and chest, a really interesting factor in this case was that there was a small fracture to the larynx, and that had to be investigated as to whether in fact Sabrina Cooper had been strangled.
Whilst detectives tried to trace her mystery friend Tony, who texted Sabrina on the day she died, investigators pursue other leads.
There will be a number of golden hour investigative techniques undertaken. That will include CCTV trawl. Not just gathering CCTV, but start to view CCTV to see if anybody's been to the address.
The police would approach local businesses, local residents who may have CCTV or Ring doorbell footage or anything of that nature to ensure that it is saved, so it is retained and can be downloaded for the police to use to piece together what had happened.
There was a camera looking towards Sabrina's house, and the footage of that became very important. It showed at 8:05 on the morning of the 18th, a man arriving at Sabrina's house. He was white, he was in his 60s, but it wasn't clear who that man was. Sabrina arrived home about 4 minutes later at about 8:09, having been walking her 2 small dogs.
They'd seen him entering the property with her.
It was almost an hour later that he had left those premises, and when he left those premises he was carrying a distinctive orange bag.
Given the information that the phone was telling police around Tony Friend, and Tony was expected to be there, saying, "I'll be there in 10 minutes," and a man arriving that can be seen on CCTV, it was a fair assumption there, of course, that Tony Friend and this man could be one and the same. It doesn't raise Tony Friend as a suspect, nor does it raise the man on CCTV as a suspect, but one or both, or if they're the same person, really becomes important to the inquiry to ascertain, is it the same person? Is this man Tony Friend? Where is he now? And what information can be taken from him for the investigation?
On Sabrina's mobile phone, Tony is how he was saved in her contacts.
To ascertain who this number belonged to, the police obviously would have first checked with friends, associates of Sabrina Cooper, and then, of course, forensically, they would have examined the number.
If it is somebody that Sabrina knows, the chances are there'll be a social media contact there with Tony, whoever this Tony could be.
Investigators come up trumps with a Tony Sabrina had recently befriended on Facebook.
The photos on that account matched the person on CCTV seen to enter Sabrina's address on the 18th of December.
Looking at her Facebook account, he was identified as Tony King.
In the same way that the police would look at how Sabrina lived her life and who she was as a person, finding the same about Tony was of utmost importance to the investigation. Who was he? How did he live his life? What other information can he give the inquiry? Knowing everything possible about Tony would have been a priority for the investigation at that time.
Detectives discover the unassuming 60-year-old is in fact a budding internet celebrity.
Tony King had a massive social media presence. In fact, I think he had 11,000 followers.
Tony's TikTok posts on social media portray him as the life and soul of the party.
Look at it! Yay!
Oh my God!
Go! Yay! Love them. This is the most best female beings I've met in a long time, with banter, communication, and humour. I'm not drunk.
He was continually and regularly posting stuff on social media. And this was rather interesting because Tony King was a loner. No real close friends did he have.
He had no fixed employment, but he was a sort of man with a van around Eastbourne.
He wasn't working and was in receipt of benefits.
He had a significant alcohol and drug problem as well.
Sabrina's family did not know very much about Tony King or their mother's relationship with him. They knew that she had a friend called Tony, who she had met, they thought, when she was out walking her dogs.
And Tony King had struck up a friendship or an acquaintanceship with her. Very casual friendship, no hint of any relationship, just a friendship. It's possible that she tried to help him, that she kind of felt sorry for him and would, just be friendly with him. A good woman just being kind to someone she felt was down on his luck.
It seems Tony also shares Sabrina's love of magic.
Here's your trick. But happy Halloween, and here's your treat. I've got a little lighter here, all right? And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to put that in my earlug, just get that right in there, and then pull it out of my mouth. Happy Halloween.
As police continue analysing Sabrina's phone, they uncover more text messages from Tony the day before she died.
What was found was clearly a text conversation arranging to meet, and it was planned the following day to come and help Sabrina pack up her boxes prior to moving.
Tony was arranging to come round and help. He was going to help lift the boxes. As far as we can tell, she was certainly preparing for somebody to come to the flat and help her with the move, and had laid out the table for two. So she knew him well enough to invite him in and make him a cup of tea. Because of the nature of the messages, with Tony saying that he was going to be round in 10 minutes, he may well have been the last person to see her alive.
As investigators review the audio from the surveillance footage of Tony arriving, something catches their attention.
When the police looked at the CCTV, we were also able to establish that he had actually said as he arrived the words, "Get in, get in." The words were said with some force and some meaning. It was obvious, even listening to those words, that one could almost infer what his intention was.
What detectives find next really blows them away.
The police found the most sensational video and earth-shattering video the day before the killing. Tony King had posted a video with a chilling message.
Watch out for my next magic trick. It's going to be awesome.
In the seaside town of Eastbourne, Sussex, pensioner Sabrina Cooper has been found murdered in her flat. Police identified Tony King leaving the house on CCTV and find an ominous TikTok the influencer posts. The night before the killing.
Watch out for my next magic trick.
The police, having watched the TikTok on which Tony King said, "Watch out for my next magic trick," immediately made the connection with Sabrina Cooper owning a magic shop, and indeed her uncle being Tommy Cooper.
Having been able to identify an address, the next part obviously would be to arrest Tony King.
First thing they'd want to do is get him in for an interview. And they managed to locate him fairly quickly. He wasn't on the run.
And at 2:35 that morning, Tony King was arrested on suspicion of murdering Sabrina Cooper. He did then go on to explain, once he had been arrested, "You're having a laugh." That was his response to being arrested for murder.
I think that first initial denial, he really hadn't anything to say about it. He hadn't formulated a story. He was caught on the hop. He hadn't prepared anything that he could say.
Tony King described or explained to the police that he did know Sabrina, he had had contact, but didn't understand what was happening because, in his words, he'd been smoking spliffs all evening and didn't understand what had happened to Sabrina.
He was later brought to the police station. He was interviewed. Tony King had a solicitor present. The solicitor was given the basics of the incident and given what's called pre-interview disclosure. He was being advised what the strength of the case was against him at that time.
As detectives start to interview their suspect, news of the arrest spreads across Eastbourne.
As a reporter, you're not party to a lot of what goes on behind the scenes, but we go and start knocking doors ourselves to find out what we can about him and his relationship with Sabrina. We found it very hard to find anybody who knew anything about Tony King. It wasn't difficult to find people who knew Sabrina. She was a well-known person in the community, but he really was a loner and nobody really knew anything about him. The most information we got about him was through his own social media.
It's about 1 a.m. in the morning. I've actually just woke up. I've had a wee. That was a good one.
Meanwhile, investigators begin a search of Tony King's property.
As soon as the police attended Tony King's address, that too became a crime scene.
They searched his home address and found a bloodied knife under his mattress in an orange carrier bag.
The importance of the police finding that orange bag was that it was the very same bag that they'd seen in the CCTV where the suspect had left the house 1 hour later after entering it.
They also found his coat, which had blood on it, and a number of items belonging to Sabrina Cooper in the pocket.
They found a set of keys. Those set of keys were the very same keys that Sabrina Cooper had reported to her daughter had been missing 2 weeks prior.
And in terms of Tony's clothing, there was clothing in the washing machine and in his bedroom, which again appeared to have blood on it and matched the CCTV images of the person seen leaving early that day. Finding a knife with blood on, finding clothes with blood on, all of those had huge relevance to the investigation.
The bloodied items are seized by investigators and sent off to the lab for analysis.
What the police will be looking for and hoping for is confirmation that that is Sabrina's blood. The forensic results that began to come back showed that the blood on the knife was Sabrina's blood.
In terms of major DNA findings, Sabrina's blood was found on Tony King's clothes. His DNA also had been found in her purse, which ultimately revealed, of course, that he had taken cash from Sabrina Cooper.
As scenes of crime officers continue to sweep Sabrina's home, more evidence is uncovered.
Inside Sabrina's address, there were blood marks there.
They had tested various areas within the flat, including Sabrina Cooper's handbag and a filing cabinet, and Tony King's blood was found in both of those locations.
Detectives surmise that King must have cut himself on the knife while at the scene. Back at HQ, they confront him with their incriminating evidence.
In the police interview, the police would have been trying to establish what had happened, what he accepted had happened, whether he was involved, or whether he was going to answer any questions at all. In the police interview, Tony King accepted that he had gone to Sabrina Cooper's house that morning. He accepted that he had a knife with him.
Tony King said that he'd had an altercation with another neighbour and that he had that knife on him for personal protection reasons. And at that specific time, Tony King admitted that he indeed was responsible for the killing of Sabrina Cooper.
But maintained he had no intention of stabbing her when he got there, and he didn't in fact know and couldn't explain why he had. He explained in the interview that he did stab her as they went into the property, but he didn't know why and hadn't planned it.
Effectively, that meant that the police could sharpen up their investigation. There was no need to trace other suspects. They in fact knew at that specific time that they had the right man.
Behind-the-scenes investigators also uncover Tony King's criminal history.
He had several previous convictions, but going back some years. The only notable conviction of concern was a conviction for being involved in the importation of drugs, for which he had received a sentence of 10 years and he had served half. But interestingly, he had nothing for violence. And that was something that the police thought was really, really odd when they started this investigation. Once Tony King had confessed to the killing of Sabrina Cooper, within 48 hours, Tony King appeared before the Crown Court, having first of all attended the Magistrates' Court. He was charged with an offence of murder.
He didn't look like a person of any real significance at all, which again is not uncommon. But he didn't look nervous, maybe a bit in shock, but not particularly nervous. Didn't look particularly dangerous, but, you can never tell.
At the Crown Court, there was then a plea and trial preparation hearing, which is the hearing at which a defendant is expected to enter a plea. At that hearing, he entered a not guilty plea.
Lewis Power, KC, heads up Tony King's defence team.
My first impressions of Tony King were that he was a rather complicated individual. And it was clear that he had to be seen by a psychiatrist, because having accepted that he was responsible for the killing of Sabrina Cooper, the next step in the criminal process was to ascertain whether he had a psychiatric defence to the offence of murder.
In Eastbourne, Sussex, 60-year-old Tony King has been charged with the murder of 68-year-old Sabrina Cooper after confessing to stabbing her. As police and the prosecution start preparing for a trial, his barrister begins to draw up his defence.
It was our task to assess whether in fact he had any defence to murder, bearing in mind the psychiatric defences which were applicable. We had to look initially to see if there was any abnormality of mind present, so that he could avail himself of what's called the defence of diminished responsibility. It was very difficult when I first met Tony King to assess exactly what sort of an individual he was. He seemed to be very cold in terms of discussing the evidence in the case, extremely cold in terms of what had happened to Sabrina Cooper, and wasn't very excitable, nor indeed did he show any emotion. We instructed an eminent expert, Dr. Christine Tizard, a forensic consultant psychologist, to assess whether in fact there was something at play here that we could utilise in his defence at trial.
And from that point, it was a matter of setting up an assessment of Mr. King. It was during COVID, so this was done remotely by video link to the prison. When I first saw him, I suppose there was a little bit of incredulity in the back of my head thinking, wow, is this man capable of this? But very soon into the interview, I sensed a volatileness under the surface. There was something very different and eerie about him. He approached everything as if the world owed him a favour. He came across as completely bitter about everything in his life.
He talked about his bitterness in terms of his childhood. Tony King came from a broken home. He spent a large amount of his young life in various care homes and progressed to Borstal and short periods of imprisonment.
He'd disclosed during his assessment that when he was a 9-year-old boy, he'd beaten another child senseless with a ball bearing for no apparent reason. He'd been violent to other children when he was a younger man. And his justification for that was that actually he didn't matter, nobody took him seriously.
I believe that bitterness manifested itself into his adult life, and he remained bitter.
I've come into a lot of questions now. What do you want for Christmas, Tony? That's a big question. What do I want for Christmas? Well, this is what I want for Christmas. I want everybody to stop treating everybody like on their fucking shoe.
People were all evil. They all screwed you over. His life had been so bad. It was in a sense just a rant of unfairness. I think Mr. King disliked anybody and everybody. He had a massive chip on his shoulder.
He felt that the world had turned upon him and that he hadn't had the best of life chances.
The assessment tries to pin down King's motive for Sabrina's murder.
I think Mr. King was a man that had never made it, was jealous of people, fancied himself with skills, such as if you've seen his TikTok with his guitar and with his magic.
Pull it out of my mouth.
And perhaps that was an attraction to him, that here is Sabrina with a magic shop and the connections to her uncle Tommy Cooper. And maybe it was, if you like, an opportunity almost vicariously for him to get some fame in his own view. He had a huge anger problem that he admitted to, and it would appear that he was just waiting for the right person for that anger to come out on, and it was a sense that somebody's going to get it because the world has been so unfair to me. Anybody who got into his close proximity and upset him would be at risk.
The overall conclusion of the psychologist was that Mr. King was an extremely angry individual who felt cheated at life. It didn't provide any explanation as to why any anger would be directed at Sabrina, but she was a successful woman who was happy with her family and home life, moving on to a new future.
I was very, very clear in my report that there was absolutely no case for diminished responsibility whatsoever. There was an underlying personality disorder, but Mr. King was fully aware of what he is doing.
I think I can sum it up on this basis, that her firm expert opinion was that Tony King wasn't mad, Tony King was bad.
More evidence is uncovered to support Dr. Tizard's conclusions.
When the police interrogated Tony King's mobile phone, they found an on-sent TikTok video. That video had the words, "I took a life today." In my mind, that showed that there was definite premeditation and planning involved in the killing. Tony King, on being confronted with the conclusion that there was no psychiatric defence available, had a stark choice as to whether he wished to continue to contest the trial or whether he wished to plead guilty. Almost immediately, Tony King gave instructions to us that he wanted an end to this matter and he wanted to plead guilty to the offence of murder.
He's asked to enter a plea again, and this time he changes his plea from not guilty by diminished responsibility to guilty to murder.
When Tony King appeared at his sentencing hearing, he did not utter one single word. He was cold. He looked once at the faces of the family of Sabrina Cooper. He didn't apologise once. It was chilling.
The court hears details of King's actions leading up to the murder.
Watch out for my next magic trick. It's going to be awesome.
It was clear in my view that he was trying to sensationalise what was about to happen. He wanted to be the centre of attention. He wanted to be as famous as Sabrina Cooper's uncle, the famous magician and comedian Tommy Cooper. He wanted to go down in history as someone who had committed this heinous act. Tony King had sent a message to Sabrina Cooper with an emoji saying, "I'll be round later." The emoji was that of an angel. How ironic it was that the following day he was the angel of death.
The court hears how Tony King was lying in wait outside Sabrina's home.
Having entered the address with Sabrina, no conversation happened, according to him.
And that anger and rage erupted. And unfortunately, that was meted out towards an innocent woman.
He then stabbed Sabrina to death.
An hour later, Tony King leaves with the £100 of cash he's stolen from Sabrina's purse. Then he makes his next calculating step.
Tony King sent a message to Sabrina Cooper saying, "Hope you're okay, girl, call you later, kiss." And the inference was that he was trying to suggest through that message that he didn't know that she was dead.
This, in fact, in our view, showed that the offence was premeditated and that Tony King was covering his tracks.
From Tony King's phone, there's a text message asking a friend to join him at the pub because he had £100 to spend. It shows an absolute callousness, a real narcissistic side to him that actually Sabrina didn't even matter to him.
Tony King is finally sentenced to a minimum of 23 years.
Effectively means that he wouldn't be eligible for parole until he's in his 80s. He's going to die in prison.
There was a sense that justice had been served in the end.
I could nearly feel a lump in my throat, looking across at the faces of the Cooper family, the sadness. This was the loss of their mother, their daughter, their sister. It was completely meaningless and completely tragic. It's a sensational loss, not just for her family, but for the whole community.
A woman's body had been found in a drainage ditch. It soon became clear that this was sinister.
There was a ligature around the neck. This is homicidal strangulation.
There was real fear. Women were having to look over their shoulder at night. Anyone in Porthmadog at that time could have been the killer.
It could be one person or it could have been more than one.
And they suddenly announced that they had arrested a man, and soon came the dramatic development. It was someone within the community.
But the witness might have been mistaken in the identification of the person responsible. A lot of people believed that he was innocent.
Was there a serial killer on the loose in Porthmadog?
Nestled on the picturesque Glaslyn estuary in North Wales is the charming harbour town of Porthmadog.
Porthmadog is a coastal town. It had been in the 19th and 20th centuries a working port where slate from the North Wales slate mines were ferried to Porthmadog and from Porthmadog all over the world. It was famous for that.
Porthmadog has a population of about 5,000 people. It's a little Welsh town. It's the Welsh-speaking heartland of North Wales.
It's a lovely part of the world. It thrives on primarily tourism. It has a very close community where most people know everybody else. The majority of people that live in Porthmadog live there all their lives and don't move away.
Some people would still keep their front door unlocked. People were trusted, and it was the last place that you would expect such a dreadful event to happen.
It was one of my days off, visiting Liverpool, and it was in the afternoon that my phone rang. It was the control room inspector to tell me that a body had been found in Porthmadog and that units were at the scene and they believed that it was suspicious. Unfortunately, this was my worst nightmare regarding location because I was at least 3 hours drive away. But I was made aware that the helicopter was going to be in the area, and it was arranged that I drove to Prestatyn and jumped on the helicopter, which conveyed me to the scene.
The body of a woman has been found face down in a drainage ditch, known locally as the Cut.
The person had been walking along, seen the body in the water, and raised the alarm. I was not informed of who she was, because it was unclear at that time. All we know is that it was a young lady.
This cut, it's essentially a water-filled deep drainage ditch, which has a certain degree of tidal current in it, washing in and out.
The location of the woman's body means that it is a race against time for the forensic team.
Your first concern with a body in these kind of circumstances is how much of the forensics is going to be lost.
If you've got a scene where there's running water, then you need to work expeditiously. There's a real kind of urgency to remove her body and take her body away from that water body so that we can recover evidence before it's been washed away.
The body was a crime scene, so you need the body out of there as fast as possible.
The crime scene manager, she informed me that a doctor had already been out and had pronounced the victim dead. And on turning over the body that was still in the water at that time, they'd found that a scarf was placed around her neck and that the end of the scarf had been forced down into her mouth.
Once the pathologist was able to inspect the body and see that there were features that were not in keeping with an accidental death, then that triggered a completely different track for the investigation. We're now in a possible murder situation.
This is homicidal strangulation. I mean, she wasn't suspended from anything. It wasn't self-suspension. There were injuries to the body, bruises. So it was quite clearly a homicide.
Also, that there was part of her clothing was disturbed, which it led us to believe that there was a sexual side of this attack. Identifying who the victim is naturally a priority, because we need to inform the relatives. We didn't know at that time whether the person was a local or someone there on a holiday. It was my suspicion, bearing in mind the location, and it was close to local housing, that it was unlikely to be a sort of tourist. It wasn't the tourist part of town, but we didn't know.
As police and CSI descend on the small seaside town, locals are becoming increasingly alarmed.
Word soon gets around It really did shock the community. Something of this magnitude hadn't happened to a local girl that I can remember. And then obviously the police activity in the area became obvious to the locals, and this huge inquiry started.
I was informed that a brother had come to the cordon and raised the alarm that his sister was missing.
The young man who is concerned for his sister lives nearby.
Well, once her brother had come to the cordon and said that his sister was missing, and gave a description of his sister, which effectively matched the young lady that we'd found, officers dispatched to the house and questioned the family more in depth regarding identifying marks, tattoos, clothing, the general description of her. The information from the family is that their daughter had a tattoo, and when the body was examined, we found that tattoo on the body. The formal identification would come later, but we were as sure as you could be that we knew who it was.
The body is confirmed to be that of 22-year-old Fionn Wynne Roberts.
Fionn was a care worker. She also had another part-time job at the football club. She was a popular member of the community, kind, loving, she was described as. She had ambitions to join the army as a nurse.
And she lived in Porthmadog all her life. She was just a regular young lady. This is an open book at this stage. We wanted to know who she had been with that night. Had she travelled home alone? So the inquiries were in the locations that she'd been and the people that she'd been in with. Who was the last person that was seen with her, or we believed to be with her? So at this point, we're totally blind. We've only just found the body. We've only just found the family. So we had no information whether she'd been with anybody that evening, and we have to backtrack in the first instance at least 24 hours.
Just a few hours before her body was discovered, Fionn had been enjoying a night at the pub with her parents.
On the evening before, she'd been out celebrating with the family, and on a Saturday evening had been doing what most young people do, socialising with friends in the town.
Fionn's father is the first to go home, leaving Fionn and her mum drinking at a pub in nearby Tremadog. At around 2 a.m, Fionn's mum returns home, and then 2 hours later, Fionn decides to make the short walk home alone.
At that time, in Porthmadog, I would hasten to say that the vast majority of people, if not all the people, felt extremely safe at walking around at night. And it was not unusual for young ladies to walk home and feel safe. And Fionn obviously felt safe enough to walk home on her own. Others had offered to go home with her, and she had decided no, she was safe enough, and she left for the journey home herself. So I think she was going home not having any worries at all, because at that stage, I don't think people did in that small rural town.
This was the last time Fionn Wynne Roberts would be seen alive. In the town of Porthmadog in North Wales, police are investigating the murder of local woman Fionn Wynne Roberts.
In a small community like that, it is a major, major shock. From people who felt remarkably safe going about their day-to-day business, suddenly a horrendous crime like this has been committed in their local town.
Fionn's body has been found in a drainage ditch in a residential area.
Where the body was found was within a couple of 100 yards at the very most from her home address. She was nearly home.
It appears that Fionn has been strangled with her own scarf, and as pathologists examine the body, further alarming details start to emerge.
It's quite obvious this is homicidal ligature strangulation. The scarf was particularly tight around the neck with the knot on one side, and then from the knot it was the rest of the scarf that had been pushed into her mouth and throat. It may have been done by the assailant to stop her screaming or crying out. And she had all the changes associated with that. So, for example, she had obvious petechial hemorrhages, pinpoint-sized, tiny red hemorrhages. And the skin of the face, so you've got two components. You've got the compression effect around the neck of the ligature itself and the airway obstruction, both combining to cause asphyxiation.
As the post-mortem continues, it reveals the horrifying details of Fion's last moments.
She was still alive when she went into that water. Now, she may well have been unconscious and dying from the ligature strangulation, but she was still breathing. There were breaths. You only have to inhale a few times to suck water into your lungs. My lungs were hyper-expanded, full of fluid. Cause of death was a combination of ligature strangulation and drowning.
Fion had suffered a swift but brutal attack.
Fion had injuries to the lips. There were bruises and laceration. Some of those may have been caused by direct punches to the lips. She also had bruises to her face, bruising to an eye. So she had definitely been struck by her assailant.
So unexpected was the attack that it seems Fion did not have the chance to fight back.
So as a forensic pathologist, we'd always be looking for any injuries which suggest that the victim has fought off her attacker. Usually they'd be to the arms if someone is being attacked with a weapon, for example. In Fion's case, there were no defensive injuries. The lack of defensive injuries suggests that maybe she was incapacitated very quickly, taken by surprise. So, did Fion suffer? I think it was probably extremely quick, so she probably didn't know much about it.
As the days pass, pressure is mounting on Detective Superintendent Challoner and his team.
You've got to look at it with clear eyes, because the objective is to find the truth and to find the offender. Everybody that came into contact with Fion for 24 hours, everybody in the pub, everybody that was out and about that night, and all those people are interviewed. So you're talking about hundreds of statements being taken. What we're trying to do is to identify everybody's movements at the relevant times in Porthmadog, because one or more of them was the offender.
Anyone in Porthmadog at that time could have been the killer.
It could be one person or it could have been more than one. We knew that a handbag was missing. So I am deciding on what is the priority about searching and expanding that search area, especially as this is a water flow and evidence may have moved down that.
And then there is a breakthrough.
That handbag was found by one of the search teams, but what I would describe as a sluice gates, which stops the estuary water coming in and flooding all these waterways. And what had been discovered there was a handbag and items of clothes. There was a set of trousers and there was a training shoe found. It is our belief that the offender had discarded them, hoping that the water in the estuary had washed them out and they'd never been recovered. But the person's aim hadn't been good and they'd been caught on the top of the gate and remained there.
Now all they had to do was find who wore them that night, who owned them. The police, they spoke to nearly 5,000 people in the area. They issued leaflets, they made appeals. They wanted to know who owned these items of clothing and the shoe.
But the police appeals for information regarding the owner of the clothes do not prove fruitful, so all hope lies with forensics.
So the process of examining the tracksuit bottoms is that we lay them flat onto an examination bench, and then we start to methodically recover any evidence that might be present. So that might include any body fluids, any DNA, and we're also looking on the surface for things like hairs and fibres. And in this particular case, that process recovered dog hairs from the clothing. So it's likely the owner of these tracksuit bottoms owns a dog. If we can recover DNA from it, and we then identify a dog that we think that hair might have originated from, we can take a small mouth swab from that dog, recover its reference DNA profile, and compare it to the hair that we recovered from the tracksuit bottoms.
And then the investigation turns in a direction that stuns the community in Porthmadog.
So often the answer to who murdered someone lies close to home.
Phone inquiries reveal Fion's brother had rung her 19 times in a short period of time on the night of her murder. Something which raised concerns due to their relationship.
There was much more than ordinary sibling rivalry between Fion and her brother. There were long periods of time when they didn't get on.
On the night in question, her brother was drinking with friends in a car park. And police also focused on the whereabouts of Fion's father.
He had no alibi because he'd been to the same party as his wife and daughter, but had left early. So he left a pub called the Sportsman's at about 1 o'clock in the morning, so was home by about 1:30, and so was a suspect in the sense that he had no alibi for the crucial few hours.
Less than a month after Fion's body had been found, her father and brother are arrested on suspicion of her murder.
And I made an appropriate decision to have them arrested so that they could be interviewed formally under caution.
Police in North Wales are investigating the homicide of 22-year-old Fion Wynne Roberts. Items that detectives believe belong to the killer have been found, and Fion's brother and father remain in custody, arrested on suspicion of her murder.
It must have set tongues wagging in a small community. It must have been very difficult to live in Porthmadog at that time, knowing that questions were being asked. Were you responsible for what happened to Fion?
But just days before Fion's funeral, having been interviewed at length by police, both are suddenly released.
The clothing, the trousers and the training shoe and Fion's bag, the forensic analysis and the DNA recovered from that did not match her brother or her father.
The police got back their DNA results. It wasn't Fion's brother. It wasn't Fion's father. It was someone else. It felt as though it was back to square one. There was pressure on the police to solve this crime. Their counsellor was even calling for a new investigation team at one stage. So there was real pressure to solve a seemingly random killing in a small town. There was real fear in the community. Women were having to look over their shoulder at night. They were being advised to not walk alone. Was there a serial killer on the loose? Was there a serial attacker on the loose? This was, a cause of major local concern.
Both locals and police are highly aware that a killer is still at large, and Detective Superintendent Peter Challoner has his own fears.
An offender goes on to offend again, and it is always a risk that if they get away with one crime, they'll commit another.
Desperate for the investigation to move forward, the police need help from the public.
We were still focused on finding out the person whose DNA we had found on those clothes. We were able to offer a reward of £10,000 for information leading to the offender. A local businessman had offered to pay half the reward.
1 month after her death, Fion's funeral is held at Capel Salem, Porthmadog.
500 people turned up at her funeral, shops closed. There was support for her family, her devastated family in this hour of need and grief.
As Fion's community grieve her loss, the investigation into her murder continues.
We weren't getting a lot of success from our appeals. We weren't getting closer to the individual responsible. And one of the aspects of an inquiry like this is that we try to make best use of the media.
There's a need to keep the public interest in what had happened in Porthmadog to try and catch the killer. TV, press, radio, newspapers came down. This was everyone's worst nightmare, and the killer was still at large somewhere. And the police felt that the answer lay in the local community, that they would find the killer somewhere in the Porthmadog area.
And because of that broadcast, there was a woman in South Wales contacted the major investigation team and told us that 20 years previously, when she was in Porthmadog, there was a similar attack in the same area.
The attack 2 decades earlier had happened just yards from the location that Fion's handbag had been found.
The young lady had left her place of work and saw a man apparently molesting a woman, and she shouted to him and he ran away.
Quite an astonishing development in the case. This woman had come across another woman in broad daylight who was crying and seemingly about to be attacked with a stone. This was a key evidence for the police. The eyewitness knew this local man. She named him. Checking back through the records, police are able to see that a court case had been held in the local magistrate's court for assault. A man had been fined, ordered to pay compensation.
The man connected to the attack in Porthmadog 20 years previously is 55-year-old local factory worker Iestyn Davies.
Once the name came in, together with the history of what he was alleged to have done 20 years previously, that was a very similar set of circumstances to the attack on Fion. And plus, it was in the same location. So immediately, he became a person of interest. A plan was put together to arrest him and to retrieve his DNA.
11 weeks after the discovery of her body, Iestyn Davies is arrested on suspicion of the murder of Fionn Wynne Roberts.
For the family, this must have been a relief, for the finger was at last not being pointed in their direction.
News of the arrest sends shockwaves through the tiny Welsh town.
You might have expected whoever was responsible to have been a stranger who was visiting this small town in Gwynedd. Not Iestyn Davies, a man who was brought up in the area. He lived nearby. He was hiding in plain sight.
He lived certainly all of his adult life in that community, and he was very well known. And there were people who, for example, had played games with him, either darts or football. At the time, he was working at a wood factory, and that was local to the area, very close to where things happened.
Yestin Davis lived near the family. He knew Fionn. And it came as a real shock to the community that someone within Porthmadog could be accused of such a grave act, such an awful, dreadful killing.
He was arrested, his DNA was taken, a police rider was on hand to escort that forensic example of his DNA to the lab. They did an examination and reported back that we had a match. The match of that DNA was from the sample inside Fionn's bag.
So, once that DNA was recovered from the handbag, it generated a match to Yestin Davis's DNA profile. And the way that we convey that match was that it's a 1 in a billion. So what that means is it's 1 billion times more likely that the DNA originated from Yestin Davies than it did an unrelated individual. And so the opinion was given that the DNA was transferred as a result of him having handled that handbag.
The case was starting to come together.
When I had identified Davis, we found out that he had a dog. So when he was arrested, there was a hair sample taken from his dog, which again went to the lab. We had recovered dog hairs from Fiona on her clothes, and we were able to do a DNA match, and that brought us back about a 2% accuracy that the dog hairs were attributed to his dog, and again we had a match.
Yestin Davies is charged with the murder of Fionn Wynne Roberts. But Detective Superintendent Challoner knows that there is one major flaw in his evidence.
The defence will make great play that the police haven't brought forward an eyewitness. Well, there isn't one. That's a fact of life. You can't manufacture an eyewitness. If no one was there, you don't have one. But of course, the defence will highlight the point that no one was there, no one's seen it.
The police inquiries relied more on technology and science than they did on looking for witnesses. There was a suspicion in Porthmadog that the killer was not Yestin Davis. He was known to the community and not generally known to have a violent disposition, and so a lot of people believed that he was innocent.
And for people in Porthmadog, there was still a sense of fear. Had the police got the right man?
Nearly 12 months after the body of Fionn Wynne Roberts was found in a drainage ditch, the man accused of her murder, Yestin Davies, is to stand trial.
The vast courtrooms. There was a tense atmosphere. This was a real human tragedy. A young woman with a whole life ahead of her that was cut so short. And throughout the trial, Yestin Davis was pointing the finger at Fionn's brother.
Yestin Davis wasn't an immediate suspect, and he wasn't arrested for some time. We raised the suspicion that her brother was a suspect, had been a suspect, and our view, as we put it, was that he was still a suspect.
Despite their early arrests, the prosecution maintained that Fionn's brother and father played no part in Fionn's murder.
They were released after those interviews, and in the fullness of the inquiry, we eliminated them as responsible in any way. They were purely victims, and they had no responsibility for their sister and daughter's death.
The prosecution puts to Yestin Davies evidence that links him to the tracksuit bottoms and trainer, items they believe belonged to the killer.
Prosecution case was based very much on there being this important evidence of the tracksuit bottoms, and they've been found in a sluice gate near to Fion's handbag and near to a muddy trainer. And the mud, the prosecution said, was from when her body had been put in the ditch. And there was also DNA evidence.
The discovery of Yestin's DNA on the discarded clothing is compelling, but the defence are able to offer an explanation.
The tracksuit bottoms were accepted by Yestin Davies to have been his. He gave an account of having washed them at work and hung them up on a fence, and they had disappeared. Now there's a logic in that, because where they were found was quite close to where he said he'd hung them up to dry, and so that was credible.
However, it is revealed that Yestin Davies' DNA was also found on Fion's clothes.
He gave as an explanation for that he had seen her on the Friday night at the station public house, and that he'd given her a hug.
So if an individual gives an account in which they have been in legitimate contact with someone before the attack, we have to consider what is the chances, or what is our expectation of DNA transferring in that setting. And obviously, if I hug someone, my DNA could transfer.
The prosecution are quick to offer their rebuttal.
2 witnesses were called to say that we've known Yestin for many years, and we don't think he's a hugging sort of person, and that he didn't know Fion well enough that he would have spontaneously hugged her on seeing her.
The defence know that the eyewitness evidence from the historic assault in Porthmadog may be harder to explain away.
The difficulty that we had with the evidence of the previous incident is that the person said that the attacker had held a rock in his hand, and the body of Fionn Roberts was found to have had a head injury consistent with having been hit with a blunt object, and that could have been a rock. So that would then become, in the prosecution's perspective, a weapon of choice.
Nonetheless, Yestin's defence team raise a simple concern that casts a shadow of doubt over the eyewitness testimony.
The witness might have been mistaken in the identification of the person responsible.
The prosecution reveal their most damning evidence so far when they present to the jury CCTV of Yestin Davies on the morning of Fion's murder. He appears to be wearing the tracksuit bottoms the police believe were worn by the killer.
It was a matter of capturing him on CCTV, capturing his movements to the scene where we believe that she was killed at the relevant time to where the attack happened on Fion. And at that time, he had with him his dog. We then capture him going back to the premises he was staying at. He changes clothes, and then he's captured going in the direction of the sluice gates. He then, after a short period of time, goes back to the premises where he's staying. What's most significant is in the first part of that journey, where we believe he attacked Fion, he is wearing the Adidas tracksuit bottoms with the stripes down the side, and when he goes back to his home and then he leaves, he is in a different set of clothing. So we believe he committed the crime, he went home, he changed and took all his clothing and his shoes, went down to the sluice gate and tried to discard them.
The CCTV evidence places Yestin Davies in the vicinity of Fion's murder around the time she is believed to have died. But Davies claims this walk in the early hours is far from unusual.
He gave explanations for that, which were very early in the morning. He had a dog, Meg, who didn't let him sleep in, and the dog woke him early, and he went out walking the dog. The police asked him about the change of clothes. and he readily acknowledged that he had changed, but said that was often his habit. He'd go out for a very early morning walk in whatever was first to hand when he got up, but then he changed into what would be day clothes later on.
In the dock, Iestyn Davies seems unfazed by proceedings.
He was full of himself in there. He was an expressionist, cocky.
He was cool, he was calm. This was a man who wasn't buckling under the pressure of intense questioning. Iestyn Davies was almost laughing at the law. There was a telling moment when he said, "I'm enjoying this." This was during his cross-examination, which was quite shocking to those in the courtroom at the time. And don't forget, we were talking about the most horrendous murder of a young woman. They painted a chilling or sinister outline of the true character of the man. A man who seemed unfazed by what he was being accused of. He was so devious. He was a man who hadn't panicked, who smirked while being questioned about a murder of a young woman.
But the prosecution have evidence that they believe will wipe the smile from Iestyn Davies' face.
There was DNA found in the knot of Fion's scarf, which was used to strangle her and gag her.
And because the DNA was inside the knot, it suggests that it belongs to the person who tied the ligature.
You have to remember that this person was found in a water body, so that there's a risk that it's going to remove some evidence. But the fact that we've got this knotted part of the scarf means that it would have been protected. It's a forensic goldmine. So DNA is this kind of silent witness.
And the DNA is a match to Iestyn Davies.
All this evidence was pointing towards Iestyn Davies. The story of her brother being the real killer, it all seemed to be becoming something of a red herring. He wasn't the clever killer that he perhaps thought he was. He was concocting lies, and his story was starting to fall apart under scrutiny.
After 6 weeks of evidence, the jury retired to consider their verdict.
We had no expectation of a result going one way or the other. There might have been a conviction, there might have been an acquittal. I stopped looking in the crystal ball many years ago. We have no idea which way a jury is going to go, and every time is a mystery.
Tensions in court are running high when, after several days of deliberation, the jury are unable to agree on a verdict.
The judge brought them back in, and they said they couldn't unanimously come to a verdict, and he gave them the option of a majority verdict.
The jury had been out for some days, and I think for many of us, we were reaching the stage, is this going to be a retrial?
Now, once they'd been given that opportunity to bring back a majority verdict, it wasn't so long after that they actually returned.
By a majority verdict of 10-2, Iestyn Davies is found guilty of the murder of Fionn Wynne Roberts.
And sentence was the only one to be expected. That was life imprisonment, with a recommendation of 25 years. That means that the defendant cannot even be considered for parole until he's been in custody for 25 years.
He probably thought all that evidence was going to be washed away in the Irish Sea, never to be found by the police. But thankfully, justice prevailed.
Iestyn Davies was remarkably stoical about it. There were no tantrums, no outbursts. He knew that he was possibly going to be convicted, and that possibility turned into a reality.
My theory is that Fionn had come face to face with Davis, he started making advances. And when she rejected those advances, he committed the act that he did.
The sentence comes as a huge relief to Fion's family and the community of Porthmadog.
They were a well-known family and a respected family. They were liked and admired because they were all hard-working people. And the community felt very strongly that they'd suffered a great loss.
In a final cruel twist, it transpires that Iestyn Davies had visited the family home just days after he had killed Fion.
And it really did add to the agony of the Roberts family. They'd lost their daughter in these most terrible circumstances. And then have the killer turn up at their home, comforting them. This was a truly grotesque thing for anyone to do.
For Fion's family, friends and neighbours in Porthmadog, the loss of one of their own continues to cut deep.
It caused huge upset. It was going to take time for the people to get over what had happened to this well-liked girl.